my time in the video game industry, which is a very interesting one, as you'll probably get from the story. So my career starts a couple kilometers from here in the Clínica Ricardo Palma. I was born here in Peru, though I left it as an infant. I left very young, and I grew up between the United States and Europe, a whole bunch of places. But one thing that I always loved growing up was video games. I was very into, I loved computers, I loved math, I loved programming, but I also loved the arts, and in particular the narrative arts. Short stories, the theater, movies, all kinds of writing. So it's not too surprising that I ended up one way or another in an industry that is in all ways the combination of two different sides, a combination of a technical with an artistic and a narrative side. So I was always very excited about video games. I played them as a child. I never really considered them a career possibility. I never considered that I might do this as a career, because I thought it was not very serious, in fact. And so it was with some surprise when, as a grad student finishing up my master's degree at MIT, to find myself doing research that looked a whole lot like video games. And I was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't actually intend to get here, but here I am. And the more I thought about it, and the more I learned about the industry, the more I realized that really fascinating things were happening in video games. I realized that it really was like being around for the early days of film. It's really the beginning of a completely new medium, a new form of human expression, a new way for people to transmit ideas and emotions. And I realized more than anything that none of this had been invented yet, or we had only just begun to invent this fascinating new medium. And so I thought, this is a great opportunity to grow, to jump into something really interesting and be there on the ground floor. I truly believe the next generation, video games will be as big or bigger than movies are to our generations. But so anyway, I found myself, recently graduated and was really deciding between three different options. One was to continue in an academic setting to do research. Another was to start my own company in video games. And another was to join an existing studio. And of those options, the last seemed by far the least interesting, because I'm a smart guy. I could do my own studio. How hard could that possibly be? In fact, I looked around a bit. I had an interesting offer from this obscure studio which was embedded deep inside of Microsoft, and I didn't want to work for Microsoft, called Bungie, and they were working on a video game with a really silly title called Halo. And I wasn't particularly inclined to take that offer until Halo was released and became an absolute global phenomenon. And when that happened, I was like, oh, well, actually, maybe I will take that job. And so I got to join as the artificial intelligence lead on Halo 2, the sequel to Halo. Now, if you don't play video games, it's very possible you don't know what Halo is. It's a what we call a first-person shooter. It's you run around and you kill bad guys. You kill aliens. You're a super soldier from the future. You kill aliens. Very silly stuff. And yet it was an incredibly successful game and incredibly influential as well, for various reasons. And so that was a chance for me, in fact, to learn the craft of video game development from some of the absolute best talent in the entire industry. And there was nothing entrepreneurial about that process. It was pretty lucky, really, when you come down to it. There was no strategy. But we worked on the second Halo and then eventually the third, and both of those continued the success of the first of the first installment of the series. At the time that Halo 2 released, it was the biggest entertainment launch across any medium. So what that means is that within the first weekend of sales, we made more money than any other entertainment property ever. Video games or movies or books or anything. So it was quite a watershed moment for the industry to realize that we had this financial clout that had never been imagined before for video games. And eventually Halo 2 was superseded in that record by Halo 3. And then I think it was Harry Potter 6 or something like that that came a couple years later that beat us again. But now it's actually fairly regular for these big video game franchises to sell absolute just millions of copies within the first couple days of release. There was some stat I heard that said that Halo 3, $50 million project, became profitable at 9 a.m. the day it was released. So you can imagine how many copies we sold that early on in the process. It's pretty incredible. So games are a big deal, is what I'm trying to say in long form. And so once Halo 3 was released, we had a lot to live up to, for one thing. And for another thing, I personally was sort of looking down the barrel of a more or less 5-year development process for the next game. So the next game was a game that they were calling Destiny. And Destiny was not set to release for another 5 or 6 years. And at that time, I was looking at what was happening in the independent game space, so the space for companies that were very small. We're talking, so just to explain maybe the scales we're talking about, Bungie at the time that we released Halo 3 was probably a 150 to 170 person company. And so, that's how you get up to budgets of $50 million or so. That many people working for 3 or 4 years, that adds up very, very quickly. And that's not counting the marketing spend that Microsoft would have put into it. So at the same time that all that was happening, that we were making these really, really big games, there was a growing industry of very tiny developers of 10 people or 5 people or even 3 or 2 people that were doing really interesting creative work. So I was sort of looking at that and realizing that, I guess we tend to talk about these big projects with 150 people and $50 million budgets. We describe them as tankers, oil tankers. It's when an oil tanker wants to turn, you have to turn about 3 hours before you actually want to see the turn start. So it's extremely slow to navigate. So you are not what I would call agile in any way at all. And these large teams end up being not only not agile, but extremely risk averse. They don't like to take risks with the things they make, and that's how we end up with these big games that are about soldiers, super soldiers killing things with guns, because that's it's a very creatively safe subject to tackle. That's going to sell so many copies, it's very predictable, and so we end up spending a lot of money making games like that. Whereas smaller companies end up being far more sort of creatively risky, like willing to take risks. And that was something that I was really attracted to. And so I basically launched my first entrepreneurial effort as an independent developer with a company called Moonshot Games, which I founded with 2 other of my Bungie colleagues, ex-Bungie colleagues. And I would say that Moonshot was a mixed success. With our first project, we went out, we sold it to investors, and very quickly got signed about a $1 million publishing contract with it. And that was after really not that much effort, and so we thought, oh, that was easy, cool. And so we weren't that worried when a short time later, the company that had offered us this contract fell apart and fired their CEO, and our contract sort of also fell apart. And so we went out and we did it again, and we signed again $1 million contract. And once again, we found ourselves shortly afterwards with the company, with the publishing partner falling apart and closing down. And so by the third time we went out to sell this same game, all of a sudden there were no takers. And what we realized was that our market had sort of shifted a little bit under our feet. We had been targeting a particular platform, and by the time we were going out for the third time to sell a project on that platform, all major publishers had all suffered their own personal catastrophic failure on that platform. And so the platform went from one with a great, bright, rosy future to one that was a dead end in a matter of a year or something like that. And so we found ourselves with basically a project that we couldn't get made. Our second project, not wanting to repeat that story, we decided to fund entirely on our own. And so we spent our own money to get the thing made, and then took on a partner for promotion and marketing and that kind of thing. And that too was a mixed success. It sold moderately well, not really enough to justify doing it again. It was critically well received. And with a lot more effort and a lot more maintenance of the property, we could have turned it into something that was worth keeping alive. But the worst part of it was that it was a slog. It was a slog for me. As president of the company, it was just a tremendous amount of effort. By this time, I had lost one of my original co-founders, and another one was only part-time. So I found myself with the bulk of both the design and the sort of business development side of things. And that took a lot out of me, and I realized what I needed to do was to take on partners, was to find new partners to sort of handle these other sides of the business that I wasn't as adept as I should be. But what happened soon after that was that I found an entirely new team, and the new team is the one that I'm working with now. We're a new startup called the Molasses Flood, which is a reference to an event in Boston. Like the original Moonshot team, the Molasses Flood consists entirely of veterans of these large studios. So most of my partners worked on a very large game franchise called BioShock. Again, if you don't know video games, you may not know the name BioShock, but their most recent installment, BioShock 3, was in one of the biggest games of 2013, so a very recent game. And once again, we've had some great initial success. We just ran a Kickstarter, and we managed to raise through Kickstarter a form of funding, by the way, which didn't exist even 4 years ago when we started Moonshot. But through Kickstarter, we've raised a first round of funding, and that's going to take us to our initial release. So when I talk about my career as an entrepreneur, I have to underline that the career is a new one, and it's definitely in development. But since I'm standing up here, I guess I get to give a little bit of advice to other entrepreneurs. And I think there's a lot of obvious things I could say. Well, I should say, first of all, that I think most of the advice that I would have would pertain mostly to the technology, and certainly the game side, but also the technology industry. So I'm not sure necessarily that what I have to say is applicable to things outside of high tech. But I think there's a lot of things I could say about fail fast, for example, or there's 15 minutes. I'm over time. But I'll be very quick. I think looking at my story, you could say that timing was maybe not right. If we had been, for example, onto the iOS App Store before the App Store became utterly flooded with free games, we would have done better. You might say if we had attempted to release a game on Xbox Live Arcade before that platform tanked in the case of our first game, then we would have done better. Getting timing right, however, is not the advice I have, mostly because I think in the tech industry, timing is always going to be bad for one reason or another. Things move so quickly that either you're sort of targeting a system that works, or you're taking a strategy that you know works, or you're just gambling. And a lot of times the people who are sort of lauded as having a remarkable foresight that a certain thing was going to work out, in other words, their timing was so perfect, I call that timing luck, because it could have easily been another thing. And it easily could have gone another way, and their bet could easily have been a different bet. So I don't think it's about timing. I think, in fact, it's about team. I think the big deficit that we had in Moonshot was that we didn't have the perfect team to make the game that we needed to. And of course, as an optimist, I do think that our new venture, the Molasses Flood, has a remarkable team. In fact, a team where among the 6 of us, we have all of the abilities and resources necessary in-house to take our product all the way to market, which was not the case for Moonshot. The story of the tech industry today is, of course, the story for the competition for talent. Big companies, including Google and Facebook, are utterly bleeding good people to startups, and small startups are cannibalizing each other in this sort of ravenous quest for good talent. And so I didn't sort of realize that the search for talent was as big a problem, even at the small scale, as for the large scale, but I believe it is. I think it's I'm 90% sure that it was Ed Catmull, the CEO of Pixar, who talks about team, and talks about team as superseding even product, in saying that you give a bad idea to a good team, to a great team, and the great team turns the bad idea into a great idea. You give a great idea to a bad team, and they destroy it. So in some sense, what matters is the team, not the product. And so that's what I think I would advise for anyone starting something up. Even before thinking about product, think about who you would make it with. That's all I have. Thank you very much.